How to Fast Track Mortgage Industry Integrations, Part 2 of 3, covers defining the API spec, detailed insights, and best practices.
So for the next couple slides, we're going to have some demo videos that I'll talk through that are created beforehand and give you an overview of once we have the BA template, we have our requirements. How do we go on and create this API? So in this overview, we're going to be talking and showing where we get those YAML files from, how we take those YAML files, the data points that we need them, create requested response, how we identify those attributes that we need from those entities, how to design a context appropriate hierarchy for the request and response. So following cardinality roles and flattening roles, we can take what we need from those YAML files where appropriate and create request response that are, I would say, more succinct, but are narrow in scope that fit our guidelines. We're going to look at how we identify the REST operations using get, burst, post, how we prepared our error messages, and then how we define the open API specification by associating the schemas to the operations. Great. Let's go ahead and take a look on the next slide. So what we're going to take a look here is, given the BA template and the requirements that we have, how do we start to form at the most basic level our request specifically? On this tab, we're going to see all the YAML files that we need, get the toolkit and take them out of it and start compiling our project. And let's take a look at the video on how we do that. As you see here, we have our spec that we received from our BA. Coming through here, going to get a list of all the YAML files, starting with the request and taking a look at any of the required attributes possibly. Snag those to make a list of the YAMLs that we need. And we're going to go through and do the same for the rest of the tabs. And then looking at the data points, and we see the API toolkit YAML file names that are BA looked up and listed here. We're going to add them to our list. And then I do see an error tab that was declared. And there's some additional YAMLs from the API toolkit. I'm just going to make note of these, add them to our list. Great. So now we're going to grab our list and get the toolkit. Since we're using 3.6, we're using the most current version of the toolkit that the group is working on from the API CLP. You can get the Mismo toolkit from Mismo's website under the API toolkit section. For this brief demo, we're going to use the most recent build on the API community of practice. So I'm going to snag it real quick and download it to our project workspace. The reason why we're doing this is more specifically low limit, so we don't have to use extensions in this example. So with the file downloaded, we're going to come back and extract it to our folder. And let's get our list up that we made from yesterday and start grabbing those YAML files from the toolkit. I see we have address listed. So let's start with address. I'm just going to drag them over. So I have them for reference. FIPS information, we're going to do the same, go through this process. So when we say API toolkit, these YAML files are core to it. And it's core to making our API and making sure that we match the Mismo specification. So what we see here is starting to build up our request, response, and error objects given the API toolkit. So in this next slide, we're going to talk about designing a context appropriate hierarchy for the request response schemas. You heard me talk about this a little bit earlier, but what we're doing is we're grabbing the YAML files. We're taking what we need for the request response, and we're showing you how we made those YAML files. We shrunk them in scope and then added stricter typing to define on our interfaces. So I'll talk a little bit about flattening model and the choices that we made and how we create the request response. So we open up our BA template and we're looking at the data points that are identified here. We see that we have some required data points. I'm going to hop into the address YAML and I'm creating the FIPS spec here just to start putting our request and response objects. So we're going to hop back over to address. As you see, I have some boilerplate code that we copied over. This is components is talking about a request object that we're building up. And we're going to copy over the whole address object just to show this first time the process that we use. So as we have this address entity placed here, we're going to start going through the process of taking out the stuff that we don't necessarily need. We have our Mismo engineering guidelines and our iGuide that talk a little bit more about this in depth of how you can flatten the model and restrict it. So given the data points identified earlier, we're going to start listing the required attributes and then go through. We are going to take out what we don't need in here, only using what we do need. As you see, we have address line text, and what we're left for the address object that's under request is just the fields we need identified. Fast forwarding a little bit, There are some MISMO types defined. In the MISMO engineering guideline and updated iGuide, there's some guidance that you can further restrict these constraints to match your system. So MISMO string can be broad. We want to make that a little bit more narrowly typed. So what we're doing is cleaning up this model a little bit more. If we don't want these descriptions there, it's fine. And we're going to update the typing given guidelines that are in the iGuide. In this case, I'm using Visual Studio Code. And there's a couple linting items I have there from OpenAPI that give you these nice squiggly lines as you go through. So we're going to go through the same process, this time for the response. As you see, it's a little bit different. I'm not going to go through the whole process of taking everything out of the model, but I wanted to show you how we can combine additional models and their data points in the response object. So now that we have our request created, we're going to go through and start creating our response. As we walk through here, going through the same process, fast forwarding through a little bit, instead of restricting, I'm just copying out the data points that we identified, given our requirements and BA template. We have our response declared. We know that we have requirements on the response, given our BA template, and we're going through and copying those over. Continuing through the process, what you see me doing is going through to the different YAML objects and getting those data points that are defined in the BA template. We're copying them into a flatter structure following cardinality rules defined in the API CLP iGuide for the toolkit. And we're going to keep going through this process. So as you see, we do have some references that are defined there for objects that do not exist or types that do not exist yet. So I'm going to copy these over as we go through the process. And guidelines show that if you have a stricter typing, there is a convention that you can enforce. So we're going through the process and we're copying over the additional types. In this process, what we've seen is building out the request object from address, only grabbing the data points that were unique that we needed in our requirements. And then doing the same for the response object, following the cardinality flattening rules defined in the API iGuide. And then additional restrictive typing. And what this allows for is validation at the edge of your API interface, ensuring that any integrating parties know the restrictions and also gives you that validation instantly before it goes too far down in the business logic layer. Great. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section. So we talked about request, response, how to create these flattened models, giving that constraint interface. Next, we're going to talk about implementing error messages. As we look at this, there are some error messages here that were defined. We're going to open it up and take a look. Same as before, we're going to go ahead and build out this model following the API guidelines. Taking a look, we have some API error codes defined and some error messages. So the error messages are some guidance that we put out given what a system may implement. Those error messages aren't defined strictly in this demo in the API specification. The error codes returned are as enumeration bodies in HTTP codes. So what we found here in creating the API and exploratory effort, that we would need some additional error handling in real world use cases, and that the MISMO API toolkit has some great models for it. What you see here is us implementing it. So as you go down, we're defining an error type object. This isn't mapped to a request response type yet. We have error message summary object that is not created. So we're going to go ahead and copy that over. And you can see the error code number type we have defined, but we don't have the enumerations declared in the template yet or in the specification file. I'm going to pop those right in and we see them defined that follows the template guidelines. What you see here is overall how the error message, how we prototyped it would be returned, error messages, an error code, and then an overall error message summary.
Thank you for watching Part 2. Please watch the next video in the series, which will cover exploring the proof of concept and transforming business operations.